Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, back with the third and final, probably, Zombies review. I mean, Descendants is getting a fourth film, so who's to say? My previous video on Zombies 2 does a lot of table setting for not just my thoughts on that film, but building up to my thoughts on this one. So let's just jump right in by first getting the more tenuous talking point out of the way. There were and are always going to be a lot of bad faith takes on these types of movies. Any film released in insert year here that strives for even basic levels of social conscientiousness is going to be unintelligibly torn to shreds by people allergic to critical thinking. Never mind the fact that the foundational underpinnings of the popular conception of zombies was invented by one George Romero, a filmmaker who leaned further into the social subtext of his work as time passed. Obviously, these films can't hope to reach that level, but that's not the point. So, I'm doing all of us a huge favor by firmly ignoring those takes and instead addressing the far more interesting topic of whether or not Zombies 3 represents a drop-off from what the previous two films established, and if so, why? The answer I came to is sort of, yeah. And as for the why, Zombies 2 felt surprisingly on point regarding the intersectionality of marginalized people, meaning that injustice to one would necessarily lend itself to the rationalization of backwards ideologies. It even understood that most people wouldn't understand any of that, which aligns frighteningly well with history. However, Zombies 3 feels a bit tone deaf regarding how that works in the now, barring a few carryover details here and there. So much so that many of its plot points work to actively undermine, or at best severely weaken, much of what the first two films really want you to consider. Now let's dig a little deeper into how I came to that conclusion, starting with the next group in line, the aliens. As individual characters, they come off as pretty fine, and the basic but functional fish-out-of-water experiences they go through are good for a few laughs. However, their place in this narrative structure feels like it's stuck somewhere between the logic of Zombies 2 and the logic of an overly idyllic social structure that does not exist, even in space. We'd previously discussed why the werewolves being distrusting of the aliens immediately works in this context, but all of that is awkwardly mixed in with whether or not this film wants to commit to the model minority myth, since the aliens seem like clear stand-ins for that form of racism. So it ends up not quite landing on either front. What's more, it feels out of place that their ability to so easily fit into a system and then bend it to their will isn't more off-putting for more of the characters, because all of them know that such acceptance can be snatched the second there's a reason to, but nobody seems to remember that all too important detail, which places the werewolves in a weird spot, because they're 5 years too late to the party after all the big plot stuff happens, making their awkwardly vindicated fears and the part the aliens played in that a moot point. Even with those oddities, a lot could have been course-corrected by way of honing in on the aliens' view on emotional stability, but that detail is only ever clumsily used to create pseudo-drama for 5 minutes at a time, but we're also meant to be amused that one of said aliens has sociopathic violent tendencies that are never resolved. A stronger story would have realized that zombies and werewolves were seen as more immediate threats because they are inherently more emotional beings, some of whom have or even had trouble controlling said emotions, but at the same time, the aliens' desire to discover their own emotions never gets to a point where becoming more in tune with that threatens their status. And that just gets really awkward when, again, there's an alien who really wants to murder people, essentially leaning into the alien invader stereotype, but nobody seems to care. And I'd be hard-pressed to argue for a real point in any of that. I really think it's just something that fell to the wayside, since the film's actual focus was Zed's college and mission struggles, and Addison's internal struggles more than that. So let's discuss how both work, starting with the Zed plotline here. This one was more disappointing to me than even the Addison bits, because there is such a ludicrous amount of political touchpoints that go into the history of higher education that this film does not touch on. Zombies have been around for about 50 years, but seemingly only in Seabrook, so the college thing makes it seem like a proper introduction of zombies to the larger world, one that doesn't have the history to even pretend to be nice in the way Seabrook has. So what does that look like? Why doesn't it occur to Zed that the sports scholarship he could obtain for college likely places him in a similar situation to the first Zombies flick? Does this college even have established support systems for zombies, or policies that would make their student body any less hostile to the change being forced upon them? And yes, these are very tough questions, one that I wouldn't necessarily expect a typical DCOM to address convincingly. But just because they probably don't have the answers doesn't mean that the question shouldn't be begged. Because by the time the movie ends, Zed puts all this work into creating the best possible application, one that's illegitimately altered by the aliens, which is a whole other can of worms, but I digress, and yet we still don't know if this college, or any college he might be looking at, is the right choice for him and his needs. Financially, yes, scholarship's good, obviously, but that literally and figuratively does not cover everything. So while I resist the urge to go full-on higher ed lecture mode and dig into every nook and cranny of an institution that doesn't even exist, I'll just state this. These gaps aren't just missing parts of what otherwise could have made for a more consequential journey for Zed. These gaps do active harm to the history of the hurdles higher education made marginalized groups jump over by pretending said hurdles barely exist, by pretending that Mountain College, who has never accepted a zombie before, is just going to break new ground with zero perspective on what they stand to gain and lose from it. The interview scene cut short by zombie hijinks and monster shenanigans is the most blunt force scene to that end. Zed's self-advocating is a nice moment within the mess, but we really don't know what he's advocating to receive. And to go back to the High School Musical well at least one more time, it's perfectly fine in a setting like theirs, where not knowing exactly what college holds for them is part of the point. Their third installment leans into the idea of this next step being one they either feel set to take or need to consider more carefully because the future be scary. But Zombies operates on a whole other level of intention, where everything Zed has been through should, by necessity, speak more to what his next step means, not less. Because of what Zombies is, these ideas can be taken to a much more involved plane, relatively speaking, but the plot, ironically, dials itself back in response. And the story taking that chance away from him just to haphazardly divide focus elsewhere feels like a rather sizable flaw. But that personal/professional critique aside, we really do need to talk about the number this installment did on Addison. For all the praise I gave to Zombies 2 for how it handled essentially the same plot, at the time of finalizing that film, they would have already known how the third was going to resolve for her, even if they maybe didn't after Zombies 1. So it's not pleasant looking back at Zombies 2, and why Addison not being a werewolf matters, only to need to view it as simply a precursor for her obtaining, quite literally, a cosmic level of importance. And I gotta say, even if it wasn't a backtracking so severe that it almost becomes darkly comedic, retroactively making her right for having the wrong perspective on her own sense of self is just about the worst thing a series of movies like these could have done. And even then, they can't commit to what such a mix of identities means for her, or how her friend should feel really slighted by her needing something galaxies away just to feel whole. Like, why is it that Addison always feels the need to define herself by culture she didn't grow up in when nothing about the culture she's known has ever treated her like an outsider? I think it's because on some unstated level, she just wants to be special, but the writing doesn't want to admit that and make her look too much like Bucky, so instead, they run with the incongruous idea of her wanting to find a place to belong, which she already has, and when she does find this other place, essentially, nothing about her social standing meaningfully changes. Again. So she both gets to identify as the minority she, for whatever reason, always wanted to be, while paying none of the dues and suffering through none of the scars that come with it, which almost works accidentally, since she's really only 1/4 alien anyway, except the movie expects us to buy into this unironically. We don't even get a hint as to how stabilizing her own emotions may have been different for her as a mixed alien compared to the full-on humans of Seabrook. It's one of the only notable internal touchpoints defining these aliens, and it doesn't even partly define Addison. And we certainly don't have the time or space, pun intended, to get into how her mother was forced to conceal don't feel this part of her for all these years. So what exactly was the point to any of this, other than to taint her previous story arcs retroactively? And what would a zombies movie be without everyone's favorite human supremacist? Now, while I do think Addison specifically being revealed as an alien is pointless and reductive, the knowledge that Bucky himself is also part alien is a better angle, or rather, it could have been. See, Bucky is a legitimately wonderfully conceived character, and not just by Disney standards, though that obviously factors in. Behind that facade of overconfidence built into even higher extremes through his genuine talent, he's just a scared, unsure teenager fighting against what he doesn't understand. He has a fairly secure place in this world. In fact, he's had it since before the first film even starts. But his fear of change is pretty firmly tied into his fear of potentially not having that place anymore. And we know his fears are unfounded, but that doesn't change the fact that his fear still exists. Almost everyone knows someone like this, someone influenced by bad faith propaganda used against marginalized people that, for many, many years and still to this day, has been shoved down the mouths of people exactly as insecure as Bucky is. Worth clarifying, since a jarring number of people still don't understand this, we are not and are never meant to agree with Bucky on basically anything. He's not a good person, and the filmmakers know to frame his most heinous actions as heinous, even if they work in the short term for his weaselly goals. But the writing for him, up until basically the start of 3, is so good at showcasing that he arguably becomes the trilogy's best character. And because of all of that, we could have interpreted Bucky's fears as internalized. If he isn't even sure who he is, or if he deserves a place among the social elites, then lashing out at anyone on the path towards upward mobility makes sense from his perspective. But the movie doesn't seem to want us to draw that conclusion, because this newfound heritage doesn't really speak to anything that's going on with him in the now, or the then. He simply takes it in stride and keeps acting like the clown car character he was relegated to this go-round. And that just feels exceedingly dishonest for a character so wrapped up in identity politics that he gladly uses it against people he's otherwise okay with, assuming they're useful to him. For this guy, of all guys, to be completely aloof about his place in this world, this world's, feels like a massive mistake and a complete misunderstanding of the character they wrote. But that really is just a microcosm of this movie, isn't it? It walks, talks, and acts like a zombies movie, but in ways that feel absurdly out of step with every other zombies movie. Like, it has to be a new level of tone deaf to have your characters talking themselves up about how far they've come, when those zombie radars still exist throughout the school grounds, and are in full view. And that comes just a movie after everyone praised how Zed found a way to control his zombie steroid mode in the aftermath of his election snafu. Now, this will sound odd at first, but Zombies 3 feels more like a DCOM than any of its predecessors, because even more so than the others, it feels hell-bent on twisting itself in pretzels to force-fit an ideal ending for everyone involved, including mythical creatures we didn't even know about. And because of that, it fails to speak on any of its jumbled plots honestly, fails to treat the character turns with a poignancy that lasts more than a scene, and fails to hold on to the social consciousness it used to strive for with substance. And even though Descendants 3 is not especially good for wildly different reasons, it's almost eerie how both of these third installments, even while helmed by two of the greatest directors Disney Channel will ever know, just sort of exist. And it's not even that either series of films reached beyond their means. Both of their second films showed that even with limited means, they could be purposeful and somewhat precise in their execution, much to the benefit of the target demographic engaging with these ideas for maybe the first time. And that does matter most, because for all I can talk from a fairly seasoned perspective about the social structures in either set of movies, it still has to work for the kids watching first and foremost. And yet, even with all the critiques I've dished out today, even with all of the eyebrow-raising missteps of Zombies 3, part of me feels almost content that it simply exists, even though simply existing in the context of what the films are is an inherent flaw. I had fun with this trilogy because, like with all Paul Hohen movies, it gave me something to think about, something to consider that goes beyond just what's literally showcased. It gave us a conversation worth having. And maybe that doesn't make for a great film this time, but maybe that's enough. But maybe next time, give us a spiritual successor to The Swap instead. Anyone else remember The Swap? It was real good and nobody expected it to be. But in any case, thanks for watching.